Opportunity abroad. My apprenticeship came to an end in the latter part of 1854, and I became an employee of the SER. Because of my ability in calculation, the company had previously allowed me some small extra money, which was helpful to my comfort and afforded me some opportunity to purchase some books and tools of my trade, particularly a good ruler and extra pencils. In the longer run, the principal advantage turned out to be letters of introduction to engineers who were building railways in the Canadas, in particular to Samuel Kiefer, resident engineer for the Montreal to Kingston section of the Grand Trunk Railway. Early in November 1854, I received a letter offering me a position where I would be assigned variously to perform whatever engineering tasks were needed as they arose. That would be my official charge, but actually to carry out verifications of the many calculations that would be performed in the routing, design, construction, and operation of the railway. He asked me to keep the latter information confidential and to note that my work may demand a certain level of diplomacy should I uncover errors. This lesson I had already had occasion to learn. Nobody likes to have their mistakes revealed. With the SER, I generally found it best to approach the person who made the calculations first and ask for help in fixing what I termed my mistake, thereby allowing them to discover and correct their own. Still, it required delicacy. Travel to Montreal through the winter was not advised, and I received another communication in December that included a warrant that would give me cabin passage on the steamship Great Britain, leaving London on April 2nd, 1855. This was exciting news, as this ship was the first to use an all-iron hull. Moreover, it was driven by propeller rather than paddle wheels, though it had iron masts for sail. She had been the longest ship in the world for almost a decade. I hoped I would be given permission to see the workings, to which there had been numerous revisions in the few years since the ship's launching. Indeed, the Great Western Shipping Company had gone bankrupt, and Great Britain was now owned by Anthony Gibbs and Sons and mainly used for the Australian route. I later learned that there were to be only 12 of us as cabin passengers and 23 in steerage, hardly a regular contingent, though 16 there would certainly be cargo. There were reports that the government was chartering ships to carry troops and supplies to the Crimea, so the ship may simply have been positioning to Canada to transport troops and materials from there. My employment with the Society for the Encouragement of Research continued right up to the end of March in 1855. The news at the time was full of the unhappiness resulting from the war with Russia over the Crimean Peninsula. There had been some riots in London. I hoped that my journey would not be impeded, and in the event had no difficulty in getting myself and my baggage to the docks. My departure from Tunbridge was, you may imagine, emotional and somewhat distressing. My mother was in tears, my father very quiet. Still, we had talked of the opportunities that the new ventures in Canada presented, and my father and uncle had both made useful suggestions of what things I might want to pack in my trunk. The voyage from London to Quebec would take over a month. In part, this was because London is on the wrong side of Britain for the Atlantic routes. Also, there were few passengers and no prestige in speed on the particular route, so it made sense for Captain John Gray to steam at an economical rate of knots and to use the sails when favorable to employ them. I was assigned to a first-class cabin with a Mr. Owens, who was taking up a position under the new Secretary of State for the Colonies. He would be getting off in Quebec, but I would stay on up to Montreal a day or so later. There was one family of 4 in another first-class cabin, 4 other gentlemen, 2 to a cabin, and 2 ladies who shared a cabin on the other side of the ship where the family had their cabin. Because we were so few, the dining saloon had been partitioned off and was used for light cargo, and I believe our luggage that was not wanted on board, though the partition blocked any view and was sturdy and locked against pilfering or interference. Because we were but 2, Mr. Owens and I could each have a lower bunk, saving us the risk of injury getting in or out of bed should the weather become rough. Furthermore, the upper bunk for each of us afforded a space to range our clothing. Before leaving home, my father had asked me how I proposed to shave on a moving ship. After some discussion, we decided that I would commence to grow my beard. This would remove both the risk to my throat and save me the daily, indeed sometimes more than daily, requirement to scrape my skin. On the other hand, I brought in my luggage, a canvas bucket. Mr. Owens found this a strange object and was possibly hiding his mirth when I put it beside the bed. However, the motions of the ship gave both of us a bad time for about a day, and my canvas bucket saved a deal of unpleasant mess on the floor. As I had been involved in surveying for the SER and wanting some preoccupation to fill my time on board, I had made myself a simple cross staff for measuring the height of objects. 17 above the horizon. Knowing that looking at the sun is injurious to the eyes, I modified this into a form of backstaff, using a small shadow target and also a small mirror that would allow me to possibly sight stars or the moon, but I still used simple crossbars to measure the angles. The using of this object had important outcomes for my life as well as contributing to my enjoyment of the trip. When I went up to the weather deck to use the device, it was for the first few days an object merely of curiosity. Then, as we left the channel and started into the open Atlantic, Mr. Stevens, one of the officers, asked me if I was calculating our position. I told him that I was trying to do so, but was purely an amateur in navigation, though my occupation as an engineer involved surveying calculations which were not so dissimilar. He said if I wished, he would let me compare my calculations with the ones he was using for the ship. This led us to both learn some new things. Stevens found my method of calculation with additional check columns quite interesting, and at one point it revealed a small error in his calculations, which he was able to correct before it put the ship on the wrong course. On my part, I gradually got better at doing the measurements of the inclination of the sun on a moving deck, so that eventually my accuracy was not so horrible compared to the professional figures. My friendship with Stevens also allowed my curiosity about the ship's machinery to be fully rewarded. The second way in which my backstaff influenced my life was that I met Geraldine, who later became my wife. While I was on the weather deck the second time I tried the staff, she said, "May I ask what your ruler is intended to measure?" which led to our initial conversation. Geraldine Mead was from Winchester in Hampshire, where her father had been a clergyman. Her mother had died in childbirth along with the baby that would have been her brother. Her father was rather older than her mother and succumbed to some crisis of the heart in 1853. Fortunately, before he died, he had arranged for her to finish her education at a quite good girls' boarding school. Geraldine was left a little money, but her prospects were uncertain. Her father's younger sister had married a man who became a merchant in Montreal, and they suggested she join them there, where she might teach in a school or otherwise use her education. By the end of the voyage, Geraldine and I had what is generally referred to as an understanding, though we dared not make any public announcement of our feelings. It is possible that we were both essentially alone and sought alliance and friendship. We were fortunate in our journey to be so few as passengers, as I believe that reduced the chances of disease. As we approached Quebec, a doctor came on board and examined every member of the crew and passengers. Had anyone had a fever or other symptoms, we would have had to anchor and wait on Grosse Isle under quarantine. 18. As I left Great Britain, I had occasion to shake the hand of our captain, Mr. John Gray. He had the reputation of a fine sailor and a stern but good master. It was with sadness I read of his loss at sea in November of 1872. He was seen one evening, then was nowhere on board the next morning. The purser found an open porthole that had been screwed tight the night before. The captain's loss remains a mystery. perhaps a fitting story for All Hallows Eve.